Hey everyone, my name is Atish Davda. I'm the founder CEO of EquityZen. Today we're talking with Ketan Bhalla. Not only is Ketan someone that I'm excited to talk about today because he has a ton of insights to share. He and I have known each other a long time. We're good friends. We work together at EquityZen, and we actually share a journey that we're going to talk about. Today we're going to be talking about the intersection of finance, technology, regulated industries, product development, really all the things that, Ketan and I have both bonded over and experienced together ourselves. Ketan Bhalla, I'm going to kick it over to you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, super excited to chat today. As Atish mentioned, we have known each other now for a decade, which is pretty crazy. I run product at House Canary, which is a real estate analytics company that we focus on U.S. residential real estate, looking at valuations and all sorts of data around the very big asset class in the U.S. I started my career at JP Morgan, kind of in what's called now TradFi, I suppose, traditional finance. Worked for a majority of that time on the alternative investments desk. So we were focusing on hedge funds, private equity, venture, and real estate. Definitely the formative years of my career. I was there for 7 years and I learned a decent amount about how finance works. I wasn't one of those folks that kind of escaped from finance. I just wanted to try something new from a career perspective and a skill set perspective. So I decided after 7 years that JP Morgan would always be there if I ever wanted to go back. But I really wanted to go to a startup that was between 0 and 10 people. I was either going to try and start something or be an early employee somewhere. That's mainly because I studied computer science in college, never ended up using it. All my friends were going to finance. This was like 06, 07 boom times. Learned a lot of skills and then ended up applying some of those skills at a few startups. I was at another startup before EquityZen called Sliced Investing. We're building an online hedge fund investment platform, trying to make an inefficient capital raising market for small hedge funds more efficient by matching them up with investors who wanted access to these hedge funds, but generally didn't have access because they weren't institutional investors. Sounds like a common theme as to why I ended up, joining EquityZen to get private market exposure more broad to the public and take this asset class that was only cornered off for super wealthy or institutional folks and really try and democratize access to it. But House Canary, we're really trying to make the real estate market much more efficient by applying technology to it because it tends to be a pretty inefficient, traditional paper-based transaction process, which we were trying to modernize.
Something you've said, Ketan, that I completely agree with, that I cannot say. Ketan said, JP Morgan will always be there, and wanted to try different opportunities. I worked at Lehman Brothers, and if I had said that, that would have been dead wrong, as it turns out. I think one of the key things that you already hit on is application of technology and how powerful it can be not only for the client base, but also the folks building it. You and I are both product people, right? Engineers, but also have devoted most of our engineering efforts into prototyping, into developing experience and a sound user interface. How has the advent of the recent tools with generative AI changed the way at House Canary versus at EquityZen or Slice Investing, or obviously at one of the more traditional industries? How has it changed the way product development takes place?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've seen a lot of efficiency gains internally from some of these new generative AI tools. So things from allowing PMs to have a little bit more control of the development process. It's influence without authority whenever you talk about product management, right? And that influence has been able to be increased a little bit because there's been a little bit more autonomy from a product manager perspective. Specifically with some Gen AI tools for fast prototyping, we, from a design perspective, wanting to make sure that we build clean, intuitive interfaces. Figma's AI tool has actually been a huge help for our PM because we've been able to use existing designs that we've had in our repository, and the PMs have been able to tweak it themselves without needing to be fully versed in design tools like Figma as an example. So we've been able to prototype things pretty quickly. It's helped to have the conversation with engineers as well. It's always easier to look at something and talk about something versus writing it out in a super long ticket, right? As much as we want to be detailed, having a visual tool is super helpful. I think the other place we've seen it is customer support. We use Intercom as our customer support tool. They've been putting a lot of effort into a tool or a feature called Fin on their side, which is kind of automated responses based on your own knowledge base. So it has context about our products and it's able to respond effectively to clients. That's been a huge efficiency gain for us because, as the kind of escalation process goes, it generally goes from support and then it goes to product to help figure out whatever the issue is. And we've been able to block a lot of those questions from even coming into product or engineering. And then engineering itself, right? We have our engineers have been kind of using Copilot from a toolkit perspective. It's not a replacement in my mind for senior level engineers that need to understand how to put together scalable products, scalable architecture. But for some of the things that are more pattern based, where we have a pattern in our code already, it's really helped increase some of the efficiency and our time to market. We've seen a decent amount of velocity from an internal efficiency perspective. Like we always want to try and iterate and ship quickly. That's kind of the goal. And these tools have really helped us do that.
That's fantastic. And it is in line with some of our experience too, meaning deploying these new technologies and capabilities for internal audience has been something that initially it still took a little bit of effort and pushing and cajoling and up, but eventually I think the embrace, we can already see it in our data that it's picking up. I'm going to date myself here. You and I come from an era where we had to take typing classes. This Beacon typing center and used to go from hunting and pecking to using the home keys and typing. And that transition, just as an example, it takes a while. It's like you have to take one step backwards and two steps forwards. And in some of these cases, it's two leaps forwards. One challenge, however, we have faced is it's a little bit harder, especially in some industries, to roll it out to the end client. Have you seen limitations to deploying AI in a customer-facing application?
Yeah, it's a great point. We've seen some challenges similar to EquityZen. House Canary is a real estate brokerage. We're a 50-state real estate brokerage, so we're in a regulated industry. To your point, we've needed to make sure that we have good controls around the way that we deploy this type of newer technology and newer non-deterministic technology, right? That's really been some of the challenges that we faced where we needed to make sure that some of the responses are in line with what we would expect. We've had to put in kind of explicit evaluations and explicit rules for client-facing AI. We have a product called Canary AI. It's a fully client-facing product. The AI itself utilizes our internal data set. We basically created a system that is a little bit agentic, and then it has tools which can query our APIs and answer questions based on our actual real estate data. But there are limitations on how it can respond based on the fact that we are a brokerage. We evaluate what the response looks like against a set of heuristics and rules. And that's come with some challenges. One very specific one is from a user experience perspective. We sometimes have to repaint answers that come back to clients. So, the response comes through, it starts halfway through, and then all of a sudden it hits an eval and we need to reevaluate the response that we're giving back to the client. Is it ideal from a customer experience perspective? I'd say probably not. The trade-off for us in making sure that we can do this in a compliant way means that some degradation of user experience is kind of acceptable from a risk perspective. But we've kind of embraced it a little bit, right? Even though we're in a regulated industry, I think the ability to really utilize some of the tools and make the overall user experience better, especially for non-technical folks who may not be able to integrate with some of our more advanced APIs, but to be able to actually interact with that data, we found that trade-off is worth it.
It's a super interesting dynamic because as a product manager, you want every
customer
to have a great experience. And almost by definition, any platform that has any scale is going to have to look at numbers and accept that, 99% of the clients have a good experience or 99.5% or whatever the threshold is you want to target. I think it's really interesting dichotomy here where you have to make some compromises and say, we're going to allow a degradation of user experience in some cases so that the majority of experiences are positive for the majority of users. That is something that is a hard balance to strike, but clearly you've described how House Canary is striving to balance on that front. On EquityZen side, one of the things we're trying to navigate is, look, LLMs are incredibly powerful, but we haven't quite gotten away from being able to feel confident in the response it's going to give. The occasional hallucination, can still sneak through. JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon actually has this method that we've been using. Essentially, they said, we're going to use AI for internal staff productivity, but we will always gate a human between the result of the AI and the end client because the technology simply isn't safe enough yet. It's a little bit closer to an airplane than a car, where there's certain things you don't want to take a risk with. You don't want 99% of airplanes to land safely. You want 100% of airplanes to land safely. When we're talking about deploying people's capital and their nest eggs, it's like the level of responsibility just has to be a little bit higher. Sometimes we do have folks ask us, why don't you have more AI tooling that's client facing? And this is a key reason why. I'm curious if you've had to navigate similar trade-offs on your side.
We have. And the way that we approached it was the types of questions that can be answered right now are very narrow. So unlike, a broad-based LLM like a ChatGPT or a Claude or a Gemini, which are generalist LLMs, and you can ask it anything, right? And it will try its hardest to give you an answer, even if it doesn't quite know the answer. The way that we've kind of architected and organized our client-facing AI product is to make it very narrow. If we don't have a high confidence that we can answer the question correctly, and that's the key for us is, we're a data and analytics company. People come to House Canary for our accuracy in data. And that's one of the key themes that we kind of pride ourselves on is our total mission is we need to give you the most accurate and reliable information. Sometimes that's not exactly how LLMs work right now. That's why we've been very careful in being very specific in the types of questions it can answer. If we don't have a tool or we don't have an agent that can answer that question well, we will come back to the client with, sorry, we don't have that capability right now. Going back to kind of the original point, it's a degradation in user experience, right? We don't want to dead end a client, right? Is like the traditional, user path dead end, which we always try to avoid when building product. In this case, we've had to accept a higher level of dead ends in order to keep that mantra of reliability and accuracy core to House Canary's mission. So that's how we've managed it. We slowly are widening, giving it more skills, giving it more agents, giving it more tools that it can use. The expansion is probably slower than most people want because of that similar dynamic where we want to make sure that we keep it very accurate and reliable.
Now, one thing you mentioned, Ketan, is super interesting is it is a mission driven, meaning it is a business culture decision for why you've taken this approach. In some cases, there's actually regulatory requirements. It's an important distinction to draw because sometimes there's no regulatory requirement, but you can still choose to operate a certain way because that's the ethos of your firm, your brand, the trust that you want the clients to have in you. And in some cases, there is a regulatory requirement. Talk a little bit about situations in which there's definitely a regulatory requirement. And even when there isn't, what are some benefits of taking a more conservative or a more kind of under-promise, over-delivered approach to it?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? A lot of people tend to shy away from regulated industries because it narrows the greenfield approach that you can have sometimes to product development. I've actually found that building regulated industries can be fun to a certain degree because it makes you think a little bit more creatively within specific bounds. So it allows you to be a little bit more focused, a little bit more narrow in the types of problems that you're trying to solve and the solutions that you can bring to try and solve those problems because there are specific guardrails in place. To your point, there's the letter of the regulation, and then there's how we interpret it from a risk perspective or a compliance perspective. We tend to be relatively conservative in our approach. We want to make sure that there's no question in what we're doing. That brings those guardrails potentially even narrower because we want to make sure that we're not crossing any lines. Yeah. Sometimes having constraints is actually a good thing because you have to work within those constraints. And working in regulated industries, you have more constraints than you do in non-regulated industries. It may mean that you can only get to 85% automation, 90% automation, and there's still a 10% to 15% manual component that you need to incorporate into the overall process. Some people may think of that as a loss. I think of that as a win. It depends on what you're benchmarking against. Are you benchmarking against the way that it's been done historically and the way that it's been operating, for the last N number of years? Or are you benchmarking to a little bit more murky future, which you believe will be there, where it's fully automated? Sometimes being able to improve the baseline is a big win, especially in some of the industries that we operate in, where they're not necessarily as advanced from a technological perspective as some other industries.
In your time at EquityZen, where we took a very conservative approach to these things, even if you weren't regulatorily required to put certain protections in place, just our ethos as a firm was, well, how would we want ourselves, our families, our friends to be treated if they were the client. Taking this approach can actually be a good moat as well, right? Like operating within regulations, not only does it unlock more creativity, demand a higher bar to clear. Essentially, there's also some benefits to it. You want to talk a bit more about how operating in a tighter environment can actually be not just a curse but also a blessing in some cases?
I think going after a hard problem with regulation on top means that from a competitive perspective, there may be more opportunity for you to gain market share or gain the trust of clients, because it almost proves that you're willing to kind of go through that fight and do it the right way. It can be a drag sometimes, but I think most good things come from hard work. It's hard work to figure out what the right way to do things are in a regulated perspective. I think sometimes that can come as a benefit because it does mean that the competition of other people that are trying to attack the same problem may be a little bit less. Therefore, it allows you to gain more trust from a client perspective, especially these days, right? Everyone's kind of competing for attention from a client perspective. Attention is at an all-time premium. There's so much that, our clients could do instead of coming to our platforms, instead of engaging with our team, instead of trying to solve the problems that we're helping them solve. Being in an industry where there may be less competition means that we have a greater chance of getting the attention of those clients. So that's one place where I think it could be a little bit more of a competitive moat, for lack of a better term.
Totally. Look, I completely agree with you. Candidly, the staying power means that not that many competitors will make it that far. That has a moat attached to it. I think the other element that, you began to kind of just touch upon is if you think about a typical customer life cycle, you have the early adopters coming in, and then you had the early majority, and then you have the mass market eventually, and then you have the laggards. And so obviously it's a simplified flow, but the early adopters, which is really the folks that most of us, when we start a business or it's a relatively new business line, without any real distribution in place, that's where you're starting off with. Those are the folks that are the most risk taking. And so the feedback they typically give you is they are very comfortable with taking the risk. They're very comfortable with, oh, that's okay if it doesn't fully work. The thrill I get is getting in early. If we over index on that as product people on that feedback, we might miss the boat on where the early majority and where the mass market, where their comfort level. If you zoom out and think about the origin, the actual purpose of these regulations, the regulation's not in place to prevent Evel Knievel from jumping over a canyon, right? The regulation's in place for most of us who accidentally might tumble over the edge of the canyon. That's why, you have the fence over there and they ask you to stand, 15 feet from the edge. If you really want to build something sustainable, larger, at scale, I just don't know that there's a way to think about regulation purely as a nuisance. It's more of a, as you said, it's a constraint. It's a constraint that does serve a purpose. It's not just bureaucratic for the sake of bureaucracy. It's meant to protect people. And once you can kind of embrace that, fine, maybe 10% of the population will feel bogged down by this, but maybe 80% of the population will be very thankful that we're abiding by these regulations. You have more access for the majority of the population and therefore typically most of the market. I think one of the things this is bringing up for me, candidly, is once again, in a world where we're talking about regulated industries, some are open to change more than others. Obviously, you said TradFi, right? A lot of blockchain-based technologies are almost forcing traditional finance companies to say, how do we want to think about tokenization? How do we want to think about stable coins? Talk a little bit about how, whether it's AI or some of these new blockchain-based technologies, how do you see regulated industries actually embracing this as opposed to, initially you resist it and eventually, it kind of crosses the escape velocity or it doesn't?
I think it'll take a little bit of time, probably a little bit more time than it takes in non-regulated industries for people to get that comfort level. But once the comfort level is there, it's almost like a step level adoption rate, because all of this time has been taken to evaluate it, understand whether or not it could work to solve some of these traditional problems that were a lot less solvable before. Once that comfort level is there, then it can flip to being more mass adoption. Whereas I think in non-regulated industries, it tends to be a little bit more iterative, where people are willing to jump in early, like you mentioned, and then it'll slowly build over time, and then start to get more adoption. It's probably a little bit more binary of a regulated industry, where once that comfort level is there, once everyone becomes comfortable, and whether those are regulators or consumer that are trying to use these technologies to try and solve these problems that have been harder to solve with traditional technology. Once everyone comes together, then all of a sudden you start to hit that escape velocity, and it'll probably be quicker, if I had to guess, my crystal ball. Like once that comfort level kind of flips to yes, then the adoption rate from a timeline perspective will probably be quicker than in some of these non-regulated industries where it's been more iterative. Maybe at some point the slope of those two lines cross, but that's kind of how I feel about it in terms of some of these technologies. I'm always a fan of trying to use technology to solve problems, and the more tools we have, and I view these as tools, right? I don't view generative AI or blockchain as the end all be all, but I view them as a tool for us to be able to solve client problems. The more tools you have, the more cool products you can build, and the quicker you can hopefully solve a client problem. So I view it as positive in the end, but I think just the rate of adoption is just slightly different from a timeline perspective.
Yeah, that's well said. And I think just looking into your crystal ball a little bit further, do you think the rate of adoption for AI versus some of these more blockchain based, some of the more fundamental? So, AI is changing workflows. Obviously, the agentic capabilities is going to make things in theory a lot faster. Perhaps you want to be careful before you let an agent just, run rampant with your credit card on the internet. At the same time, you have some of these more ledgering and kind of rails that are being rebuilt. Just talk about, yes, there's different rates of adoption, but do you see one of these newer technologies having a faster adoption curve than some of the others?
If I had my crystal ball, I do think LLMs will likely have a quicker adoption cycle, mainly because they are easier to understand, easier to interact with from an end user perspective than blockchain technology. I think blockchain technology is super powerful, but the ability for an end user to kind of understand it, there's a higher bar there for comfort. If there are end consumers that may not be as technologically focused, I think it's a harder technology to get your mind around than LLMs are. All the credit in the world to the companies like OpenAI, Google, and the Anthropics of the world who have made this LLM technology extremely accessible, and they've met the end users kind of where they are from a technical perspective, right? You can interact with LLMs via API if you're a developer. You can interact with it via user interface if you're an end consumer. They've brought the product to where the client sophistication level is from a technical perspective. I don't know that I can say the same necessarily for a lot of the blockchain technology, where I think it still takes a decent amount of technical understanding to fully understand the power of that technology.
Well, it's certainly true that many more people take a look at the adoption curve charts for ChatGPT versus even Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is at this point, 17 years old, and ChatGPT had several breakthroughs in technology in 2017 and in 2012. But really, it really captured our imagination in 2022. ChatGPT was just 3 years old, and this generative AI, in terms of mass market adoption, is really 2 or 3, most 4 years old. Many more people are using that than are utilizing, Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrencies as a means of exchange. So certainly, I think you're onto something there.
Just one quick thing on that. I think part of the reason that they were so successful from an adoption perspective is they provided these magic moments from a user experience perspective from an LLM like ChatGPT. In the earlier days, like being able to write a song in the style of some
wow.
Right? Yeah, exactly. The wow factor, that magic moment was like, oh wow, I don't quite know what the utility of this technology is going to be, but it's kind of magical. And that is really what helps spark the imagination of all these kind of mass consumers and using that type of technology.
That's a really good point, because it's not just about capability; it's about actually desire to get people hooked in on it. Okay, Ketan, one final kind of piece of advice for product managers, for founders, for investors. How should they think about not just the technologies we've thought about, but also if you just have philosophies you want to share about the approach?
I'll try to boil it down to 3 main points here. I think one is not something that's debatable, which is just like continue to learn, evolve, be curious about these technologies, especially from a product management perspective, understanding how they can work and how they can be applied as a tool to solve problems. I think that oftentimes can really set folks apart in terms of their career. The second one is maybe a little bit more controversial in some of the product management discourse that's going on right now, which is I believe that it's a huge advantage to be technical from a product perspective because it allows you to better understand how the technology can be applied. Part of product management is being that glue between the various parts of the organization. I think it allows you to have higher level conversations with engineering counterparts. And then the third one, from an overall company perspective, from an overall kind of operator perspective, goes back to something that I mentioned before with OpenAI, which is I think it's important to meet clients where they are, right? Change is hard. Like getting users and getting clients to change their existing workflows or to adopt to your standard or to have to go to your platform to do things is difficult. As much as you can meet the clients where they are, if they're a technical user, give them the ability to interact with things technically. If they're a non-technical user, give them really great user interfaces. If there are tools that they already use, see if you can integrate into those tools. It just helps a lot on adoption. Oftentimes, I think change is underestimated and how hard it can be sometimes. So those are the three.
I love it. Continue to learn, be technical, meet your audience where they are. Ketan, I just want to say thanks for taking the time. It's pretty clear that in your own journey, and echoes of it are in my own as well, there's just a certain love for the harder path, as you say, because if nothing else, there's an opportunity to learn, which kind of goes right back into kind of the three things that you have found to be extremely valuable in your own career.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Ketan, thank you so much for the time. We appreciate it.
Yeah, this was awesome. This was fun, and hopefully we can do it again soon.